Episode 14, The Murders in Nyamandhlovu. My back started to hurt. Within a month, I couldn't stand up, let alone work with stone. The disc at L5 had herniated and ruptured. After 9 years in the quarries, picking up 1,000 tons of stone, it happens. Bad back, go figure. After surgery, the doc told me I couldn't pick up more than 20 pounds for a year. I was back at work by the end of the summer. My doctor also told me I made a remarkable recovery. During my convalescence, I made pretext calls for Don. The foundation of Don's business had always been locating people, especially ones that didn't want to be located. You're not going to be much of a bounty hunter if you can't find anybody, and Don was one of the best. Our clients were creditors. They hired us to find their debtors. Our clients would furnish a name, date of birth, social security number, and a location within a couple states. The first thing I would do is call the E-Verify line of the Social Security Administration and verify the social security number and birth date. Don had amassed the phone numbers of every unemployment office in the country. Once I had verified the social, I would pick an unemployment office in the target state and call them up. I would pose as their counterpart from another state, in essence, just one colleague reaching out to another. In the unemployment offices at the time, they employed a communication system called the IBQB. It was basically an email system that connected all the unemployment offices across the country. I knew their buzzwords. I would tell them that my IBQB was down. The system had been messed up all morning, and my supervisor was on my back. I got to get this case cleared. I would tell them I thought the guy might be double-dipping, drawing unemployment here in my state and also drawing in their state. At that point, 90% of them would ask me for his social security number, and we were off to the races. All the personnel had been trained not to tell anybody anything over the phone. Sometimes they'd say, "Look, I can't talk to you about this over the phone." If they said they want help, I would ask to talk to their supervisor. I get about half of them to look my guy up for me. If I struck out, I just called another office. What I hoped was that I would find where the individual was working. If the person was employed and was having unemployment withheld, his employer's address would show. I was looking for the address of his employer. His creditors could find him from there. There's technique in everything. How to solicit information from people that are trained not to give it, or sweeping the floor. Everything has technique. The next winter, I took my 16-year-old daughter out of school and headed back to Africa. I brought her because she was a great travel companion, and I needed someone to watch my back. We weren't in Kansas anymore. She'd been training for 10 years. She wasn't a natural like her brother, but she made up for it with effort and an indomitable will. She made more U.S. teams for international competition than either me or my son. Through the AAU, you can qualify for that year's international competition by winning first or second either in the Nationals or the Junior Olympics. She was a silver medalist and received an invitation from the World Karate Organization to go to the World Cup in Hungary. The day she got the invitation, I pulled into the driveway and she came to my truck. She gave me the letter, and as I read it, she said, "It's been a perfect day, Daddy. I got a 95 on my math test. I got this letter from Wuko, and I grew into a C-cup." I always liked that girl. She made the U.S. team for the World Championships in the U.S., South Africa, and Germany. She went to England and competed in a national tournament there. She was a top fighter. She fought the two-time world champion 7 times and beat her 5 times. The 2 losses were at the World Championships. We were embarking on a 1,000-mile trek in a country where the government was hostile to our skin color. I had no problem with the local people, but I was aware of the desperation their poverty created. Although my daughter had been tested in 100 rings, she'd never been in the real world. But I knew I had a partner I could count on. After all, she's my blood. The father of one of the Zim students I'd been teaching over the years had an African curio shop. He had a number of assagis, the Zulu stabbing spear, carvings in kudu horn, bone, and wood, lots of wonderful stuff, all priced higher than I could afford. The man wanted retail price for everything. It just didn't make any sense. I had to pay for shipping. I was doing this for profit, not just for the exercise. Cutting out the middleman was something I intended to do on this trip. I had bought 4 big totes of used clothing that I had scavenged from family and friends. These people were desperately poor. They couldn't afford to go to whatever few stores there were and buy a new pair of blue jeans. The year's goal was to buy art. In previous years, I had traveled all over the country. I've been to Harare, the capital, and just about everywhere else the roads in the country led. I had a good handle on what was available in Zimbabwe. I've been to Harare, the capital, and just about everywhere else the roads in the country led. I had a good handle on what was available in Zimbabwe. We flew into Johannesburg, rented a car, and spent the night with Sensei Leo and the Black Dwarf. The next day, we were off to De Wet's. After a couple days, we headed north to Martin's. I rented an SUV, which would be used for daily forays to different art marts, where we would buy pieces and then bring them back to Martin's. I asked Martin if he could help me find shipping boxes for my pieces. He said he knew a man that imported water pumps from India, and that boxes they came in would serve my purpose. The next day, we took Martin's pickup truck and went to see this fellow. Martin had called ahead, and 2 of the boxes were ready. We got there, and Martin backed up to the boxes and opened the tailgate. I stepped out of the truck, and Martin introduced me to the owner. As we were talking, 2 of his helpers came forward and moved the box to the back of the truck. They tilted it over so it leaned against the tailgate. Then both men got on the same side of the box. They started to lift the box, and it just rolled off the tailgate. I'd never seen anything like that in my life. I started to go to the other side of the box so we could lift it up, but the owner touched me on the shoulder and said, "It's best not to watch. Let's have a cup of tea. They'll figure it out." I took my girl to the Zambezi River to see if I could drown her, and I almost did. It was winter, and there was a huge volume of water in the gorge. It was nothing like the last trip, but the water was even more powerful. You could get swept into an eddy, and it would trap you from the main flow. We had John the Baptist again as our guide, and he called it getting sent to jail. At one point, we were trapped in a whirlpool, and it took us 4 attempts, all 7 hands paddling together to break free. That's not to say the river was flat, not by any means. I was looking at my daughter as the raft took a bump. Her eyes got big, and she disappeared over the side. She was not a short swimmer. We looked around but couldn't spot her. She was gone. 30 seconds, 40 seconds, no orange life vest. Then she appeared right next to the raft. When she went overboard, she went under the raft. Her life jacket popped her up and pinned her to the bottom of the raft like Velcro. It took her a bit to get her orientation in the dark water, rolled over, and clawed her way from beneath the raft. Well, we were all glad to see her. After we completed the trip, we stopped on the way back to Martin's, just south of Victor Falls. We found a large thatched roofed pavilion that housed a number of local artists. They carved the teak into reflections of the wildlife that surrounded them. Beautiful herds of elephants, Cape buffalo, giraffes, rhinos, turtles, you name it. They carved everything except for one animal. They didn't carve monkeys. They said it would be disrespectful to their ancestors. As soon as my daughter and I walked beneath the roof, we were swarmed by the artists. Chaos ensued as each artist tried to get me to look at his work. My daughter was the only woman present. The press of the crowd and the volume of their demands continued to intensify until my daughter shouted, "Shut up!" The effect was instantaneous. African women keep their mouths shut. They were shocked into silence by this girl's audacity. Once I had their attention, I told the artists that I wanted to see everyone's work. I was here to buy their art. My daughter had a notebook and a pen. I told them I would go to each of their stalls, pick out items, list them, and in 2 days I would bring my friend's truck and I'd pay for them. I was planning on buying more than my SUV could carry, and I had arranged to use Martin's bakkie to bring my purchases back to the farm. Once they all realized that they had a chance of making a sale, they wanted money to hold my purchases until my return. I resisted the idea until one of the artists told me that they didn't have anything to eat. They were looking for food money. They hadn't eaten all day. I agreed to a deposit. I started at one end of the pavilion and worked my way down to the other. At each stall, I would look at the items and pick out what I wanted to buy. My daughter would list the purchases in her notebook and the amount of the deposit I paid the artist. I told them I had money and I had clothes and we would complete our deals in 2 days. I gathered them together and posed Sensei Leo's question. Who is the best fighter? In short order, a fellow half my age came forward to the acclamation of the crowd. I watched how he moved. I had honed another skill over the years. I could read my opponents and know if they were going to be a problem. After a few steps, I could tell this guy had nothing I couldn't overcome. Once that was established, I told the crowd that I was coming back. I would have a truck and we would complete our transactions. But if there was any trouble and my deposits were forgotten or my items sold, their champion and I would fight. I did this to preclude any problems. I tasked their strongest guy to keep the deal. I made him accountable. It was a 6-hour drive from Vic Falls to Martin's farm. We rested for a day, and then my daughter and I jumped in Martin's buggy and headed to Vic Falls. We got there in the afternoon, and I found everything as we left it. Once again, I worked my way down the pavilion from stall to stall to finalize my purchases with the artists. I acquired some great stuff. They acquired cash and clothes. I didn't haggle. I paid them what they asked. The whole country was trapped in a horrible scenario. We finished our business as night fell, and I loaded the truck. Just then, people started to appear out of the dark. They were just trying to sell me some of their handiwork. Word had gotten out that there was a buyer around, and by the time the sun went down, 50 or 60 people started swarming around us. It was reminiscent of a scene from The Walking Dead, with the zombies pressing forward with their arms outstretched, but in this case, they had carvings in their hands. I had money and a little bit of room, but as I looked over their goods, I saw no quality. My wing daughter said, "Get in the truck." I did, and we left. To be an impressive people who were only hoping to eat was a new experience. The old Rhodesia was called the breadbasket of Africa. In 1965, it had the highest per capita income of any country in Africa. At the same time, the wage discrepancy was a black would earn 1/10 of his white countrymen. However, every citizen was afforded a free education, medical care. More importantly, few were going hungry. The old-timers talked about how life was better under Ian Smith and the white-run government. Martin was right. It was a typical African dictator scenario. We got back to Martin's farm about 1 in the morning. It was a long day. My daughter and I spent our days making forays all over Zimbabwe. The roads were in great condition for a number of reasons. They had been built well by the former Rhodesian government when their export market was huge. Grain and tobacco trucks rolled down the roads toward the ports in South Africa and Mozambique. Most of the soil was decomposed granite, which is a great road base. Another huge factor in the survival of a road is frost. No frozen water to start potholes. One unfortunate bonus was that there were very few vehicles on the road. In the old days of Rhodesia, there would be significantly more traffic on the roadways. However, the new Zimbabwe didn't lend itself to prosperity. The new regime couldn't afford to trim the verge. A tall grass grew right on the edge of the road that created a wall on either side. The speed limit was 60 miles an hour. It was like driving in a tunnel, a twisty tunnel, where you didn't know what was going to be around the next corner. We did a handbrake emergency stop more than once for herds of goats, elephants, and giraffes, and innumerable donkey carts. It was so challenging that we were talking about developing a video game based on it. So many points if the elephant's charge was real, fewer if it was a mock charge. They say you know the difference because in a real charge, the elephant doesn't stop. Then there were the roadblocks, the checkpoints, heavily armed government soldiers every once in a while. What do they say? Rot starts at the head of the fish. What's this soldier going to do? Is he going to expect a bribe? How many points do I lose if I overpay? If he's an honest soldier and runs me in for trying to bribe him, will I have to fight for the blanket in jail tonight? I make light of it, but the country was in the grip of a dictator who for 20 years had spouted propaganda against white-skinned people, and the British and Americans in particular. I didn't take it personally, because this is the way of the world. I just needed to be smart and lucky at the roadblocks. Lots of possibilities in our African road trip video game. I found some woven reed baskets in a little village. The work was exquisite. They were made to last for generations. I had brought coloring books and crayons for the kids. They'd never seen anything like it. I also had some big disposable lighters, another item the villagers had never seen. Once they saw it operate, they were stunned and amazed. It was like magic for sure. On karate nights, we would stay at Martin's house in Bulawayo. Martin, his kids, and my daughter would all go to class. By this time, I had a great rapport with the students and their families. One of the students' mothers specialized in cargo shipments, just like mine. So when I had completed all my acquisitions and everything was boxed up and ready to go, she had arranged with Martin to take care of the shipping by sea back to New Jersey. It was heartbreaking to see everybody in the country suffering. The blacks had no food and the whites' money had no value. Everybody, white or black, wanted to get out of Zimbabwe. More than 1 million Shona and Metabili crossed into South Africa. I met a man, I don't believe he's one of my karate students' parents, but a friend of somebody in the group. He had a wife, a boy and a girl. He had gotten permission to immigrate to New Zealand. His teenage daughter had participated in a current rage called jungling. White girls would have sex with black boys. Unfortunately, this girl had been infected with AIDS from this encounter. Consequently, she could no longer be allowed in New Zealand. Her father faced a terrible choice. He was enraged with her. This was at the height of the AIDS epidemic. How irresponsible to have sex without protection. Should he abandon her and go to New Zealand? Should he sacrifice the rest of his family and stay with her in Zim to face a bleak and uncertain future? Will his daughter die? Everybody else is. And you think you've got problems, huh? I may have misspoke when I said that everybody wanted to leave Zimbabwe. Martin didn't. It's in his blood. Where would he go? Where would his family go? Where would his mom, Gloria, go? But the question is, why should he go anywhere? His family's history in this country goes back generations. He just wants to raise cattle to feed his countrymen and live in peace with his neighbors. Mugabe had run the country into the ground for the last 20 years. He had political rivals that he either murdered or they lived in fear to the point where they really couldn't go in public and campaign. His soldiers would go into the rural areas and collect everyone's medal ID. They were told, "You better vote for President Mugabe or we'll come back, and we know who you all are." Mugabe blamed England and America for the country's woes. He was on the state-run TV most nights decrying how the West was causing all these problems. To try to stay in power, he gave the so-called war veterans land. In general, these properties belonged to white farmers. The properties were taken over by people that didn't know anything about farming, and the country was now starving. International food aid was pouring in, but under Mugabe's control, it just added another weapon to the dictator's arsenal. The Middle East wouldn't sell him any oil because his currency was worthless, and he owed them millions for past shipments. When fuel did arrive, it was gone from the gas stations in a matter of hours. How can a country carry on commerce with no fuel? My daughter and I got home in February, and life continued pretty much as it had been before. Karate, the quarry, and odd jobs with Big Don. I traveled to state fairs and other events where I rented a booth to sell my African art. In that experience, I learned that the people that make the money are the people that are renting the booths. E-commerce really hadn't taken off at this point, so between the cost of the booth rental, travel expenses, and hotel costs, it was a break-even proposition at best. The Celts had run their course, and I hadn't done the programming in a number of years. I would call the vet and Martin on a monthly basis just to check in. I gave Martin a call on April 14th, 2000. We chatted, and he told me that a busload of so-called war veterans had showed up on his property. To be a war veteran, you'd have to have had fight in the Bush War back in the 70s. Martin said he saw very few men that were old enough to have been veterans. He recognized one man in the crowd as he came to the fence. Martin, always armed, told the man, "If it comes to it, you're going to die today." That threat was enough for the busload of squatters to have a change of heart and leave. You have to understand that this is a lawless country. It's ruled by a dictator, and as such, he dictates the law. To help you understand Martin's country at the time, a Washington Post article entitled "Mugabe's Cereal Policies Ravaged Zimbabwe's Economy" sums it up. In President Robert Mugabe's Zimbabwe, a 7-ounce hunk of cheddar cheese costs more than 14 ounces of the same cheddar cheese. Motorists line up for hours outside gas stations with no gas. The government has shut down all foreign currency bureaus. Bakers are required to sell regular bread for less than it costs to make. So instead they sell raisin bread with a few raisins, or poppy bread with a few seeds, or a twisted bread with a few twists at 5 times the set price. A recent foreign diplomatic cable summarized Mugabe's new budget with one word: surreal. It's Alice slipping through the rabbit hole, we're living in Wonderland now, said Brian Rapatopoulos, the chairman of Zimbabwe in Crisis, a coalition of civic groups. It would be funny if it wasn't so sad. Mugabe's notoriety stems mostly from his decision to seize productive land from white farmers despite a looming famine. But land grabs are just part of the command and control and economic regime that longtime president is trying to impose on Zimbabwe. And bread isn't the only part of Mugabenomics that seems twisted, as the government issues an ever-expanding list of financial dictates, most notably price controls on everything from Palmolive soap to T-bone steaks, and currency controls fixing the official exchange rate at about 3% of the real exchange rate. Zimbabwe's once vibrant economy is imploding. Unemployment is nearly 70%. The stock market has crashed. Inflation is officially 144%, but really much higher, while wages are relatively stagnant in a country where most people earn less than $1 a day. Zimbabwe's $500 bill, worth $9 US at the official rate, or about 30 cents on the street, is known as the Ferrari because it goes so fast. The economy is shrinking 10% a year. Even though the retail and housing sectors are booming, people with money are racing to spend it before it loses more value. Mugabe has said the fuel crisis is giving him stomach aches and headaches. The latest joke here is that Zimbabweans have the world's highest IQ. IQ for gas, IQ for bread, IQ for sugar. The food shortage facing Zimbabwe is no joke. The United Nations estimates that 6.7 million of the country's 12 million people are at risk of starvation. The government has a monopoly on grain imports into Zimbabwe, but it is desperately short of foreign currency, so it is now drastically short of food. Its land distribution scheme drove much of the nation's agricultural expertise into exile and handed much of the nation's fertile soil to Mugabe's allies who have no farming experience or poor farmers that have no access to seed or fertilizer. This is expected to wipe out as much as half of next year's harvest. Mugabe's price controls on maize and other staples are making the problem worse. Many farmers say if they weren't facing a drought, they wouldn't want to plant crops because they would sell at a loss. They went after the white people, but it's the black people who suffer, said farmhand Abraham Philly, who was evicted from an irrigated plantation that lays fallow. How do I feed my children now? Philly and many of his fellow villagers have begun panning for gold in the Piriri River. But even that livelihood isn't beyond the reach of the long arm of the state. Mugabe's government just announced regulations barring the sale of gold by alluvian gold miners, among other scofflaws. Mugabe was a rebel leader in the guerrilla war that gained Zimbabwe its independence in 1980, and he has been the nation's head of state since. For much of his rule, Zimbabwe has seen an African success story. Until recently, it was considered a breadbasket. Mugabe tends to blame his country's current problems on drought, Western colonialism, and capitalism, peppering speeches with attacks on greedy entrepreneurs, ruthless markets, and the forces of economic policies. During a speech this month at the Central Committee meeting of his ruling party, the Zimbabwe African National Union Patriotic Front, he accused his country's bourgeoisie of charging exorbitant prices. While many manufacturers and traders want to blame it on production costs, it is clear that consumers are being ripped off, abused, and taken advantage of by avaricious, heartless business people, several of whom want to politicize production processes in sympathy with white landed interests, he said. While Mugabe studied Marxism at the University of London and is commonly referred to here as Comrade Mugabe, most economists say his policies are driven more by authoritarianism than communism. Since voters rejected Mugabe's bid to rewrite Zimbabwe's constitution in 2000, let me interject here. He wanted to write the constitution so he could actually be president for life, and that was defeated. Continuing with the article, especially after he attained power in a disputed election marred by violence this spring. Mugabe and ZANU-PF have moved to consolidate their control of the country, and that is the common element of all of Mugabe's economic policies. Now listen to this. Zimbabwe now requires its pension funds to deposit nearly half the reserves with the government at paltry interest rates. So inflation is draining away pensions. Banks must buy government debt on the cheap as well. And as of this month, manufacturers must trade in half their foreign currencies to the government for Zimbabwean dollars at a ludicrous official rate, and must deposit the rest of the currency in government banks to be withdrawn only with the government's permission. The nation's industrial trade group says half its members might close their doors rather than comply. It's tough, said Callisto Yanyoka, the CEO of a refrigerator manufacturer. What you learn about business in books is not practiced in this environment. The politicians have their own agendas. Charles Zambi, a shopkeeper in Harare, got a taste of this new economy last month when the police charged him with profiteering. His crime? Selling a 5-kilogram bag of maize for 350 Zimbabwe dollars. The official price was supposed to be 150, but Zambi had bought the bag for 320. His profiteering amounted to 2 or 3 American cents. Still, his maize stocks were confiscated, and he was fined 5,000 Zimbabwe dollars. Every day it's getting harder to survive. Zambi said, "It's like making money is illegal." I love that quote. Mugabe's latest response to Zimbabwe's underground economy was this month's list of price controls on yarn, window frames, building sands, and a host of other products. The price controls also tried to address the twisted bread problem and the related problem of merchants who split up price-controlled packages and sell both halves at a higher price. It is now illegal to manufacture, produce, or provide any such good or service under a new name or brand or in units not previously offered for sale, except when written authority from the ministry. The government also announced a recruiting drive to find more inspectors to enforce the price laws and has dropped hints in the state-owned Herald newspaper that some kind of freeze on salaries could be imminent. John Robertson, an economist in Harare, warned that this cycle of controls, evasions, and more controls cannot last long, and it's impossible and inadvisable to try to stop entrepreneurs from providing new goods. In mid-December, Mugabe shut down all currency exchanges, but they moved to back alleys. New price ceilings on furniture and refrigerators have simply prompted merchants to demand cash up front. Meanwhile, Mugabe's government is spending half its revenue to pay interest on its debts. The more foreign currency it tries to squeeze out of exporters, the less incentive they have to export, or at least to report their exports to the government. A recent editorial cartoon in a Harare paper portrayed the funeral business as the only growing industry in Zimbabwe. Look, there's only so long that you can defy the laws of supply and demand, Robertson said. It's like defying the laws of gravity. Pretty soon, you're going to come crashing down. The deepest crisis is the fuel shortage. Zimbabwe had a contract to import Libyan oil, but it missed payments, and the flow has slowed to a trickle. There's hardly any gas in Harare, which has not stopped drivers from lining up at stations for hours upon hearing rumors of gas. Buses are grounded, cars are left at home, lines snake around entire city blocks, choking off all of 4th Street and half of Robert Mugabe Road. "All we do is look for petrol," said a taxi driver. "It's all anybody does around here." Mugabe doesn't have that problem. He still rides in an armored Mercedes limousine with tinted windows, surrounded by 24 motorcycles and sport utility vehicles with their sirens blaring. The motorcade is known as Bob Mugabe and the Whalers, and now it's a crime in Zimbabwe to make rude gestures or comments as they pass by. "It's all about total power," Robertson said. "The economy is just one more way to expand control. I want you to try to put yourself in Zimbabwe at that time. I don't care about your skin color or profession. It doesn't matter. Walk a mile in Martin's shoes." Another component of life in Zimbabwe was the CIO, the Central Intelligence Organization. This was President Mugabe's secret police. Whether it's called the Gestapo, the Stasi, the SAVAK, or the CIO, secret police throughout history have a very bad reputation. No one ever compared the KGB to the Elks or the Rotary Club. In all authoritarian regimes, there are secret police. And just like in the cults, everyone informs on everyone, for either favor or to be spared harsh treatment, always looking over your shoulder to see who's watching. Under the Nazis, when the average citizen left their house, they would open the door and look left and right before stepping out. It was known as the German look. You will toe the party line, or you will be canceled to death. Welcome to Martin's world. As I said, I talked to Martin on the 14th of April. On the 18th of April, I got a call that woke me in the night from DeVette. He was in tears when he told me that they had killed Martin at the farm. As time had gone on, many Google pages have been written about what happened on the compensation farm that morning. My understanding of events that occurred come from following the event online and later speaking to his widow and children, as well as my other friends in Zimbabwe. About 6 o'clock in the morning, 120 squatters/veterans showed up at Martin's gate. Some reports indicate that they were 5th Brigade soldiers, the president's North Korean trained hit squad. They were armed with AK-47s. Most squatters can't afford that weapon. Unbeknownst to Martin, before the soldiers came to his fence, they had secured his workers, who were housed in a compound nearby. His workers were Metabili, and they would have died for Martin. Martin came out of the farmhouse and went to the gate. The leader said he must leave the land. Martin said he would, if they would only leave him his little house and the fence around it. There was a water tower a couple hundred yards directly behind Martin. A sniper had climbed up it, and as Martin was negotiating at the fence, fired. The round hit Martin in the leg. He made his way back to his house. He got inside and put a tourniquet on his leg. Then he called the Commercial Farmers Union on the radio. He told them that he was under attack, wounded, and needed medical assistance. Unfortunately, once the 5th Brigade had passed through Nyamandhlovu, the road had been blocked, so no medical or any other kind of help would come to Martin's succor. The gun battle lasted for hours. Someone in the Commercial Farmers Union had a plane and at one point flew over the fight. The invaders breached his gate and flooded the front lawn. From the number of cartridges they left on the lawn, the rate of fire must have been intense. Martin, armed with a 9mm, .357 Magnum, 12-gauge shotgun from the war, and a scoped hunting rifle, continued to return fire. At one point, he was shot in the arm. Members of the Commercial Farmers Union tried to come to his aid, but were unable to do so because of the roadblocks. They were unable to do so due to the roadblocks the squatters, the 5th Brigade, had set up. He had called his mother Gloria a number of times and asked her to call the police. Gloria called, but no help would arrive from that quarter. As word of Martin's dire situation spread throughout the community, another plan was hatched. When I told you the story of Martin saving his friend from a crocodile, I told you 3 things happened. This is the third. The son of the man that Martin had saved from the crocodile would attempt to drive through the brush to save Martin if it were possible. I don't know if Martin, by radio, was aware of this man, but when he saw the young man's vehicle approaching, he used his rifle and started putting rounds to the windshield to warn him away. The young man got the message and left. At some point, the squatters realized Martin was not going to be easy to kill. Outside the fence, Martin had a shed where he kept a couple of dirt bikes. The squatters got gas out of the bikes and made Molotov cocktails. They set his place ablaze. He retreated to the bathroom and fought on from there, his house burning around him. Eventually, conditions grew unbearable. He took the bath mat and wet it. Then he placed his 12-gauge shotgun under the bath mat in hopes it might survive for his son. He stepped from the house where he was captured, beaten, and shot twice in the face. The state-run media reported that peaceful squatters had approached Martin, and he had opened fire on them. Luckily, they were able to neutralize the trigger-happy farmer, with only one squatter being slightly wounded. I continued to follow the story online. The BBC reported 90 soldiers came off the property. It had reported 120 had arrived. So why were only 90 leaving? If only one was slightly injured, they all should be leaving. The numbers just didn't add up. I wouldn't know the solution to this problem for some months. Martin spent a lot of time on the farm, and he kept his suits there. They all burned. Honoring his love for karate, his widow had him buried in his gi. Shortly after the funeral, his 16-year-old daughter was in a pharmacy in Bulawayo. She was approached by a man who was an agent of the CIO. He called her by name and told her that they knew who she was and her family, and they were next. The family saw it and was granted sanctuary in England. I imagine the millions of people who have entered America seeking sanctuary must have similar stories. I trust you know sarcasm when you hear it. They left for England as soon as possible. After a month, the daughter, an avid horsewoman, got a job training horses. She called a friend in Zimbabwe and asked him if he would go out to the farm and look in the barn for a particular saddle that she wanted him to send her. The friend went, and as he approached the barn, he smelled an awful stench. He had an idea what the smell came from. He went into town and brought the police. They excavated a mass grave that contained 30 bodies. The math finally added up. Martin had dispatched a quarter of his enemies. I guess telling the truth wouldn't be great PR for Robert Mugabe. The body count also lends credence to Martin's statement that 8 of his Gray Scout mates against 120 sergeants was good kit. I think Martin was killed for a number of reasons. He was a mighty man. He wasn't going to bend the knee. And the incident with the crocodile showed how powerful his juju was. An example had to be made. A year later, Martin's mother, who still claimed possession of her son's farm, was murdered as well. AK-47s were again used in her slaughter. Martin's brother found out, the sole surviving member of the family. He rushed to his mother's house. Newspaper accounts said that he went berserk and barricaded the house. When local police came to investigate the crime, he fired upon them and they left. Hours later, a group of his neighbors and a clergyman got him to leave his mother's body. I can't say I knew Martin's brother. I only met him once. I can only fantasize about the stress he must have been under. Imagine, your brother dies in a bloody conflict defending his property that's been in the family for generations. Your mother's killed. You find her bullet-ridden body. What do? Will the killers be back? The police were at least complicit in your brother's murder. Are they to be trusted? Maybe securing the house and shooting anything that moves is a good strategy. Referring to Martin's mother, the vice president of Zimbabwe boasted, "We fixed her. They thought we were joking." Mugabe, in fact, had become president for life. He ruled his countrymen with an iron fist until the day he died at the age of 95. He outlived Martin by 20 years. This is the way of the world, dearly beloved. That was my last trip to Africa. I came back to the States and closed up the stone quarries. I passed on the dojo to my senior student and moved to California for the 5th time. Dear listener, if you have enjoyed this episode, please share it. A 5-star review on Spotify or wherever you listen would be greatly appreciated. You can follow me and my Mastiff, Drax the Destroyer, on the It's in the Blood Facebook page. Or you can send me an email at jesse.it'sintheblood@gmail.com. Thank you so much for your support.